Sorry, guys. So, hi, I'm Finux. If you don't know me, I'm sorry, blah, 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 blah. I'm going to talk about the similarities between the Manhattan Project and the global surveillance news that came out recently. Well, I say recently, about 2 years ago. I'm going to talk about the Manhattan Project. Hands up if you know what the Manhattan Project is. Okay. I'll not do the German joke, but right. So surprisingly a lot. I live in Germany now, if you're wondering where all this German stuff comes from. I'm going to talk about the Manhattan Project. I'm going to talk about the Global Surveillance Project. You know, PRISM, blah, 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 all of the stuff that stopped The Guardian from going bankrupt. Yeah, well, you know, people have got to eat, right? Like, let's not get bad. So, the first striking similarity between both the Manhattan Project and the Global Surveillance Project is, surprise, surprise, they're both top secret projects. As I said this earlier on, in the highlight, the Manhattan Project employed 110,000 people. 1,000 knew what they were doing. So it can give you a rough idea about what you can really get away with without people noticing. So the first striking similarity between the Manhattan Project and the global surveillance stuff is that both events suffered from whistleblowers. Few people realize this. This guy called Klaus Fuchs. Do you guys know who he is? If you're a Brit, you should be very ashamed of yourself right now. This is the reason that we have a nuclear project in the UK. Okay. Klaus Fuchs was a German Jew who suddenly found that home was a little bit hostile towards the beginning of World War II. Came to Britain, sought asylum. We gave it to him, and he became part of our equivalent to the Manhattan Project. He is also a traitor to Great Britain as well, and was convicted for treason and sentenced to 14 years. He is also the reason that the Soviet Union had a nuclear weapon too, but we'll talk about this later on. So when you think about the damage that can be done, this nameless soul that no one really knows did far much more than this one that we all know. But all roads lead to Russia as well, right? Which is a little bit strange. So for people that are wondering what the Manhattan Project was about, the Manhattan Project was about building a nuclear weapon. So just before World War II starts, they managed to split the atom in Berlin, and everyone with a grade school, like a high school grade education in physics, understands very, very quickly that holy shit, we can make a bomb, and we're just at war. That might be really handy. But to be fair, what was really hard for people to get their head around was trying to explain a nuclear weapon to people that only have experience of conventional weapons is about explaining bigger bangs, right? I mean, it's a problem that we have in security. I mean, we're going to have a bang. Well, we've got bangs now, but it's going to be really big. How big? 10,000 times big. Your head just doesn't comprehend it. So how did the Manhattan Project start? Well, the Manhattan Project started, like all great projects start, by fear, uncertainty, and doubt, right? So who knows who this guy is? Right? Einstein. Einstein had a choice of coming to Britain and had a choice of going to America. Where do you think he went? Yeah, he went to America, right? So he writes a letter and goes to see the US president and explains to the US president that the Germans, Hitler, has a nuke, right? He's going to nuke you. You need to start building a nuclear weapon. They have weapons of mass destruction. And if we don't start now, we're done. It's over. We need to start doing now. He was as famous then as he is now, right? So if you're talking to one of the world's most famous scientists telling an American president, build a nuke, what do you think happened? The Manhattan Project started, okay? It, to date, is still one of the most expensive projects that the US military ran, okay? This, do you guys know what this is?
TNT.
No, this is a nuclear reactor. This was actually the first nuclear reactor. This is where it all gets batshit insane, right? They built this in Chicago under a sports field. Not any nuclear reactor as well. The first nuclear reactor. They had no idea. These are control rods, and they pulled them out to start the nuclear reaction. Okay? I can guarantee you, if you built a nuclear reactor in your basement, you're probably going to go to jail, right? It's not a challenge for you to accept, by the way. It's just friendly advice. It's not something that I would get into. They actually had health and safety officers there with buckets of distilled water, because, you know, neurons are scared shitless of distilled water, right? They had no idea what was going on, and they built this. And what they were able to prove is that they could start a reaction process. And then the project begins. So what we find with theory is it's really easy to think about shit, right? It's really hard to put it into practice. So they knew that they could split an atom and produce a nuclear reaction. They just weren't too sure about the best way to go about it. And what they knew is the materials that they had were not sufficient for the job. Basically, they needed uranium-238, which they'd only ever produced in lab quantities, which is a couple of grains of sand. What they needed was pounds and pounds and pounds of this material and no idea how to do it. So this was the first problem that they had to solve. And it was a bit of a problem for them because there's different theories of how you could enrich uranium. So it was wartime, it was to save the war, it was to save civilization, to stop Hitler from being so bad, blah, 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 blah. So they hedged their bets and went for every way that they knew to enrich uranium, they'll have a go at. And they built a number of plants. They spent $2 billion in US wartime, $2 billion in 1944, right? Or 40, well, early 40s, they spent $2 billion. But the equivalent of $26 billion today. So pretty cheap if we think about the what we spend now in war. Interesting story for you. The Los Alamos plant consumed 10% of wartime America's electricity. To put that into context with you, they used more electricity than Chicago and Boston put together, right? No one noticed. So anyway, they build a number of plants. Here are some of them, 5 of them. Los Alamos is probably the most famous. This is a gaseous infusion plant. This is very interesting. You see these legs here, this U shape for the building. These are half a mile long, okay? Only up till 1980. Then, 1983, I think the US government disclosed what this building was. Up until then, they didn't. Which is quite interesting because this was the largest military building ever built, and still no one noticed, right? When they built it, they had no idea what they were going to build. They just knew it was going to be big, right? That's all they knew. So when they laid the foundations for this thing, they didn't know what they were going to put on the roof, right? They hadn't thought that far ahead yet. They still managed to get out. It's also slightly radioactive too, so don't go visiting, right? General Groves is an interesting character. He's the guy that built the Pentagon. He's also the military arm that supported all of these physicists. We'll talk a little bit about him in a little while. Here's a famous story. I feel that physicists and hackers, we have a little bit in common at the moment, right? So you have this military guy go to his military leaders and say, I can't work with these physicists. They're all prima donnas. I just cannot get a straight answer out of them. Every time I speak to them, they just speak to me in a different language. Sounds a little bit familiar, right? I hear this all the time. So,
sorry to disturb. Jonathan Creasy? Yep. If you like to comment.
So, an example that he gave is when he spoke to his physicists about building some of their plants. The physicists said, "Oh, because they didn't know, this was a research project, right? They gave their estimates to a factor of 10, okay, which doesn't sound. It sounds like conservative, but then you have this military guy who builds military buildings like the Pentagon, who isn't really used to this gray area. You need to tell me in black and white what you want, and I will build it. That's kind of how this works." And he was explaining to Eisenhower that it's like me arranging a wedding party for 1,000 people, but maybe 30 will turn up, or maybe 3,000 will turn up. You can't expect me to build these things. And basically, what they said was, "Shut up and build these things." So the scientist won in this story, right? Another interesting thing about Los Alamos is this is an interesting plant. So a guy called Oppenheimer, who I'm pretty sure you've heard of, he was asked to head up the project. It's a little bit of a controversial choice, to say the least, right? He spoke to Groves, and what Groves wanted to do was split all the scientists up and put them in different parts of the country because of security, right? Departmentalize your resources so that if someone compromises a site, they don't have the whole picture, which is very typical in a military way of doing things. Not so typical for theoretical physicists who are building the world's first nuclear weapon. They might need to be around each other. So they came up with a solution where they were going to build a camp specifically for building a nuclear weapon. They were going to bring in all the brightest, and they were going to put them in the camp. The problem with this, you don't take lessons from Chicago, right? So in Chicago, you're going to build a nuclear reactor and fuck the city, right? They sat down and thought about it and went, you know what, let's put it in the middle of nowhere, right? Just in case something goes wrong, let's not put it in a dense popular area. So they went for the middle of the desert, 200 miles away from anything. Another interesting security talk, right, aspect. Always be careful about what knowledge you know and where you disclose it. And an example to this is, so they build Los Alamos, they start shipping all of these physicists away there, and there is this little train station that nobody has ever used, ever. So you go to Chicago, catch the train to this place, you get picked up in an army jeep and taken off to Los Alamos. So the train clerk has started noticing that that station that in the whole 20 odd years that I've been working here, no one has ever taken a train to, all of a sudden we're starting selling tickets and there's nothing there. And to compound that problem, they're not even getting return tickets, they're just getting single tickets. What is going on? Needless to say, he was relocated from his position. And we shall never talk of this gentleman again, right? But yeah, OPSEC, it's not just a dream, right? So, yeah, we'll move on from this stuff. As I said, the Manhattan Project employed about 110,000 people. It's pretty big, right? It's a huge deployment. Numerous of these people had no idea what they were doing. They were doing just general day-to-day operations. So some of the plants had a whole city culture attached to them. I think Alamogordo, I think the one in Tennessee, had 2 football teams, had baseball teams, had cinemas, shops. The big whole amount of people were working there doing things. There's an interesting story about this. When the Manhattan Project becomes famous, everyone, it's a bit like when you ever speak to an American, right? If you ever speak to an American, they always know someone who was on the Mayflower, right? And it's a bit like this with the Manhattan Project at the time, right? Whenever everyone had a story about working for the Manhattan Project. Well, there was a woman who did have a story. she had the very strange job of working in the laundry and waving this magic stick over the laundry, and when the stick started making noises, she was to go and get the general. Well, the stick turned out to be a Geiger counter, and what she was decontamination. So basically, click, 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 oh, we've had a leak, I'm going to get the general. But this was her job for years. She had no idea that she was frontline decontamination. So just give you a rough idea about how need to know it actually was. I always find that story is amazing, right? I don't know if she ever did hear any clicks, right? I'm guessing not, because she's still around to tell the story. So 1945 happens, and who knows what happens in 1945? The Germans surrender. So for a long time, they'd been building weapons to specifically attack the German threat, okay? The Germans are going to nuke us, and all of a sudden, Germany, it's not all of a sudden, it's not an unknown, this was on the cards for a while, but Germany surrenders. And what do you think happens to the Manhattan Project? It just carries on going like Germany's still in war. Remember, Germany had weapons of mass destruction, right? And they were going to nuke America, and oh my God, if we don't do something now, we're never going to be able to do anything. This is the German reactor, the non-functional German reactor. Turns out they were slightly preoccupied with occupation and didn't find too much time to do R&D for nukes. So they had very, very, very little in the way of any program whatsoever at all. Although I will tell you whether their research turns out it's quite interesting, right? So this is the inspection of their reaction. As I say, absolutely no nukes, right? It's strange, isn't it? Like, I remember an incident couple of years ago where we invaded a country because they had weapons of mass destruction, and then like, oh, what do you mean that there is nothing here? You know what's interesting about that story is one of the huge parts of evidence that was given was by a guy called Hans Blix. Does anyone know who Hans Blix is? Yeah, he's the nuclear weapons inspector who told them, yo, they can make uranium, they can make a bomb, they've got the infrastructure, they could have a nuke, right? It's the same story that was used. Very, very interesting. So, us Brits and Germans, we worked this all out, right? You know, surrender happens. However, the US is still at war with Japan. So World War II is still kicking off, it's just not in our backyard anymore, right? So this is the interesting story of U-boat 234, okay? A fucking amazing story, hugely interesting. But I only find the story interesting because of the context of the implications. The context is still pretty harrowing. So who knows why we were able to hammer the German Navy so hard? Yay, InfoSec again, right? We broke Enigma. So we pretty much broke the back of the Germans' naval systems. And U-234 was the biggest U-boat that they had. A problem is they didn't have too many sailors left. They had a good way of sinking them. Pretty much stops them from being useful, right? So there's a rookie captain that they give to this, and it's U-boat 234. So towards the end of the war, as we discussed, the Enigma was a huge player, right? So the only way that Germany and Japan were able to communicate securely was to send, it was secure is such a relative term, right? But the only way that they could communicate was to send U-boats to each other, right? So that's how they were communicating. They were putting like officers on boats and sending them, and then we were trying to bomb them on the way. So U-234, two Japanese ambassadors make it to Germany, and Germany's history is written in the books already, right? It's coming. Hitler knows it's here, and Japan make an argument that if the war is to succeed, it needs to be the flag bearer, right? Whatever Germany can assist Japan, it needs to do it now. and Japan will continue on fighting. It's a very desperate act from Japan because Japan were in no winning streak at this point either. Bizarrely, Hitler agrees with them. And what he does is he takes U-234, which is a battle-class U-boat, under the sea boat, as they like to call them, right? They strip it and they turn it into a cargo vessel. And then what they do is they put basically Hitler's treasure trove of evil shit in the submarine. It's got spy planes, some new weapons, and all of the Germans' nuclear project, which was some U-235, which still needed to be enriched, but it was a good starting point. It was the plans, their ideas. I mean, it's not going to give you a bomb, but it's a bloody good start, because up to this point, Japan didn't have anything. So off they send. Well, it's interesting if you speak to, there's some videos of the German sailors that were on the decks saying how weird this whole thing was. These two Japanese guys came up, they didn't speak a word of German, and they started walking around and writing U-235 on the boxes. The German sailors had no idea what the cargo were, they just thought these were stupid Japanese guys, right? U-235, the boat's U-234, right? Seriously, this is what they thought. No, the Japanese were writing U-235 for something else. So anyway, they set off, and off they go. And we break the code being sent out, and we don't know what's on the boat, but we sure as shit know that it's important. There's enough noise going on that we're sort of very, very interested in it. So we basically start bombing its path. This boat's good to about 300 feet, okay? The bombing was so severe that they took the boat to 600, okay? Far, far beyond what it was supposed to do. I mean, a depth charge anywhere near them could have easily sank them. And there is reports that this is not the only shipment of uranium that was supposed to be sent to Japan. You know, there is belief that some uranium is still in broken U-boats at the bottom of certain seas. But so off they send the boat, right? Bombing away, you know, the Germans survive an onslaught like you wouldn't believe. They finally outrun the Allies. They surface up. They get reception to get their signals, to get their commands. And they hear that Hitler is now dead and that the Third Reich has surrendered unconditionally. You are to raise a black flag upon your mast and you are to sail to your nearest Allied fleet and surrender. And of course, the commander of the U-boat doesn't really have a choice, right? If he ignores those commands, he is a pirate, right? And he will be hunted down as such. Which is a really interesting problem because they happen to have two Japanese guys on their boat who haven't surrendered, who are still at war with America. And the only vessels in the area are a Canadian vessel and an American vessel. And the Germans have decided that they want to, for some reason, surrender to the Americans, not the Canadians. No idea why. They give bad signal intelligence to the Canadians and head out to meet the Americans. The problem is, you have these two guys on board that went onto a ship full of allies when they started and became prisoners straight afterwards, right? Well, it turns out these two ambassadors also happen to know a little bit about submarines. So the U-boat commander was a little bit concerned about this. And he locked them in their rooms, relieved them of their weapons, blah, 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 blah. They didn't hear from them for a couple of hours, went in to check, and surprise, surprise, they've committed suicide, wrote notes, blah, 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 blah. Okay. Sad tale. And the wife of one of the ambassadors said that she believes that her husband could have sank the ship, but decided that to save everyone's life, basically, and that he would just take his own because he was not going to be taken by the Americans. So anyway, the boat comes along, they surrender themselves to a US fleet, small little ship, they put it under guns, they bring it into the US dock. Only when it pulls in do you realize that it's the equivalent of like a Chihuahua shouting down a Rottweiler. It's a tiny little boat and a big boat, and it's like any day of the week and twice on Sunday, the Germans were always going to win this argument, apart from this day. So they hand the boat over. And this is when they start to look through the itinerary and work out that actually what is aboard this boat is slightly interesting. Uranium is quite a rare property. It wasn't enough to build a bomb, but they had enough uranium in there that was pretty cool. So the Manhattan Project turned up and took the uranium and then threw it into their reactor and turned it into uranium-238. And that made part of the bomb that they dropped on Hiroshima.
We got there eventually, didn't
So history having a cruel sense of irony, yes, it got enriched and delivered by the Americans. Okay. History has a very cruel sense of irony, right? It's not enough to make a bomb, but it's a sizable amount. You have no idea with what care they treated this uranium. They got the uranium and threw it in the pile with the rest of the uranium, right? It wasn't like, and the little bit of the ball here is the German part, woo! So yeah, they took something like 400 pounds and turned it into 50 grams. I mean, that's the kind of attrition rate you're looking at. This is Little Boy. This is one of the weapons. It's a bit strange they call it Little Boy, right? It doesn't look so fucking little. Oh, that's why they call it Little Boy. This is Fat Man. It's not the Fife and Tayside Metropolitan Area Network for anyone from Janet. This is a bad boy, right? You don't want to mess around with this one. This is basically the gadget. This is the test piece. This is quite funny, this story as well, right? So about 5 years they took them to get this far. And finally, they've made enough plutonium and uranium, they've got enough to spare, right, to blow up a test piece. So they're pretty sure that Little Boy is going to work, right? It's a piston system. It's inefficient, but it will work. But they're not too sure how this, which is an implosion method, will work. So they go to the desert. And well, they have a little bit of problems along the way, right? So they bring out this great big bomb. It's 4 days, they're constructing it, craning it up. They're out in that Alamogordo, which is called Death Valley, by the way. Apparently, if you, in the New Mexico desert, if you're caught on this path without any water, you'll die. They thought it was a great place to start Project Trinity, which is Alamogordo, where they build the gadget. So anyway, they take the gadget up, they start building it. They take the plutonium core, they go to put it in the gadget, and it doesn't fit. Right? After 6 years, the plutonium core does not fit in the bomb. Dunk. Oh, shit. Oppenheimer loses his shit. This guy's been pretty cool all the way through it, but he's at this point where he's like, whoa, 4 years, we've been building this for this long, and you're telling me that it doesn't fit? Science, right? What they forgot was that the case had been out in the sun for 4 days, and that the heat in the sun had expanded the metal components of the device. And all they needed to do was leave the plutonium core out for a couple of hours to get up to similar temperature, and it dropped back in. But just for a couple of minutes, boy, did they think they fucked up. You can imagine how nervous you would be. Like, $2 billion later, and a bit of plutonium that doesn't fit in. Well, it did in the lab. No, we didn't knock over your web application. So, the most infamous picture we probably see throughout history. This pinnacle moment that changes everything, really. They had no idea. When I say to you they had no idea of what would happen, they took bets, right? So, you know the sweepstake where if someone's pregnant in the office, you bet on the baby's weight? That's exactly what they did here. Like, hey, when it goes off, how many kilotons? Well, I'm going to take 2, I'm going to take 20, I'm going to take 13, I'm going to take 11. These are the scientists that are building this shit. They had no idea, right? They just knew it's going to be a big band, right? Okay. They were a little bit right. So they had spectators, it's like 200 miles away, right? This is how far you can see this thing. And their advice was, when the detonation goes off, lay on your belly with your feet towards the explosion, right? And you'll be okay. Thanks for that. Like, I really needed you to work that shit out for me, right? So anyway, Edward Teller I'll talk about in a little bit. Do any of you know who Edward Teller is? Yeah, he's really the harbinger of death. So he'd managed to scare the shit. He was one of he was a Greek that went to America. Fantastic physicist, very, very egocentric though. He managed to set up a bet. He managed to basically scare the whole entire camp that there was a possibility that the nuclear weapon was going to ignite the atmosphere, right? Which you can imagine, if you're a military person, that's probably slightly worrying to hear. I mean, for any other person, it's a little bit concerning as well. So General Groves walks into the office, speaks to Oppenheimer, shouts at Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer says, oh no, we've crunched the numbers. Edward's got it wrong, okay? It's only a 1 in 3 million, right? And there's any chance you could pull that door to for me? There's a 1 in 3 million chance that we could ignite the atmosphere. You can imagine as a general, it's that one that kind of has you panicked, right? So he managed to convince the whole office that we're going to blow this up and we're going to lose the atmosphere. We're glad to report that Edward Teller was wrong, right? But you know what they did? They still fucking turned it on, right? Like, well, you know, we're not going to turn 3 million of them on. It's okay, right? So, yeah, they blow it. This is probably one of the most infamous quotes that you'll ever find from Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer is a complex character, passionately believed in the atomic weapon, adamantly against thermonuclear. I imagine that once you build a war stopper, you probably don't want to be involved in building too many more. We have an equivalent of Oppenheimer, I cannot remember his name in the UK, who once we built our weapon in Project Equinox, burnt all his papers. He burnt all his papers, his journals, everything. He didn't want to be remembered in life as someone who built a nuclear weapon. So it's a bit of a tough cookie to carry, I imagine. But as I say, America is still at war with Japan, who quite clearly doesn't have a nuclear project because you've just enriched their uranium, right? So you're kind of ahead of the game. You know that it's not going to happen. So there's a few logistic problems in dropping a nuclear weapon, right? Like, you can't just turn up, you can't send it via DHL, right? You know, the Royal Mail is not going to deliver this for you. Yeah, we need a signature for that, okay? So they had to practice flying planes. These guys had no idea what they were doing until later on. This is the most amazing story ever. See this guy here, right? He found out he was going to do the first bomb run for the nuclear weapon. And he thought this plane is going to be the most famous plane in history. And he was sort of right. So he named it after his mother, Enola Gay. So history now records that Gay bombed Hiroshima. But, you know, interestingly enough. So they practice this run. They go and do it. You know, when we speak about Snowden, we talk about why didn't he use official channels, right? This is just a little segue for you. Why didn't he go and speak to people about what he discovered? You know, here's an example of people involved in the Manhattan Project writing, saying, we've seen the demonstration of the weapon. You cannot drop this on Japan, right? They have no nuclear project. You cannot do this. You need to set up a demonstration and show them you cannot drop this on people. This is the petition that they set up in Chicago. This is the petition that they started for Los Alamos, that Oppenheimer himself stopped from being distributed throughout the rest of the camp. This is the official channels. And their answer is to quiet all of these prima donna physicists, as they like to call them, was they were going to have a debate where they were going to have a debate basically with the president's men about dropping the weapon. And don't let history confuse the selection of their bombing targets. They specifically chose civilian areas to drop their bombs. If you look at where both bombs were dropped, there were military targets that they completely missed in the choice to bomb down the center of town. Another interesting fact for you, Hiroshima and Nagasaki both were not bombed by conventional weapons for a good 11 days prior to them being bombed, because what they needed was a city intact so that they could gauge the damage. So you were sitting there, if you were in Hiroshima, and thinking, wow, everyone else is being bombed and we're so blessed. Yeah, maybe not. But like I say, this is the official channels that quite clearly didn't work, right? These are the people that built it saying we can't do it. Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This is the case, by the way, of the black box, right? Anything we should just build stuff out of whatever they build those arches out, right? Like, that's the shit. They send a lot of the Manhattan scientists away to look at Nagasaki and Hiroshima. None of them are pretty much the same afterwards, right? It's quite hard to get their head around. I mean, we sit there and we laugh about nuclear weapons, but you know, this is a girl that doesn't have any more eyes, right? There's still a huge amount of damage done on this. Japan didn't have a nuclear project. Japan was pretty close to surrender. It's a lot of debate that this weapon was dropped a lot more to scare the Soviets than it was to beat the Japanese. And you can sort of see this later on. So Russian intelligence. We haven't spoken about the Russians. It's not secure. It's not cyber without the Russians, right? So let's do the Russians bit. So the Americans get a game changer of a weapon. The Americans drop it on a country that doesn't have any weapons. And another country without any weapons looks at it and goes, holy shit, they're going to do that to us, right? So Stalin decides, we might want to get involved in this nuclear research project shit, right? And we're like, well, we've tried. No, we're going to do it. No, we tried. No, if you don't do it, I'm going to kill you. And trust me, he killed a lot of people, right? This is, by the way, IP theft plus, right? Surprise, surprise, the Russians are pretty known as a land army, right? They like to march and take over shit, right? They don't like to fly in, we just walk, right? We're doing it. So the Russians had planes, but they didn't have any bombers. And they're a little bit it's pretty much back to the same again. We can't DHL it, so what are we going to do? Well, we're going to need a bomber. So we've got to build a bomb and a bomber. Yeah, no, fuck that. The Americans build it in Mexico, right? Yeah, okay, send an agent with a suitcase full of cash to the factory and bribe someone to give you the plans. And that's exactly what happened. So this is the Tupolev, and this is the Flying Fortress, which is an exact carbon copy, because outsourcing, they paid the Mexican and they got the money, right? They didn't give a shit, did they? And they were, yeah, sure. This is the best anecdote ever. I don't think I've ever heard a better anecdote than this one right now. So the reverse engineer looks at the American Boeing plans and says, yeah, we can make this, but we can make some improvements here, here, and here. Stalin says, no, I want an exact copy. Now, sometimes in life, people say stuff without thinking, right, and get to tell the consequences, and this is one of them. So Stalin says to the reverse engineer, no, I want you to build an exact copy. And the reverse engineer says, do you want us to paint the stars on it too? And then Stalin walked off, right, and the guy lives to tell the tale, which is surprising because there was a lot of people that died for a lot less than that shit, right? It's like, whoa, dude, if you ever meet, like, he's like a legend in my book, right? I mean, this is how we get into trouble, right? So, anyway, basically, the Tupolev is a carbon copy of the Americans. So the Manhattan Project, the Russians, the whole Russian weapon system, basically their first, I think it's called Red Joe, is literally a photocopy. Klaus Fuchs gave the Russians the plans from the Manhattan Project. So, talk a little bit about Klaus Fuchs. What he was part of our project, when we got involved in the nuclear game before the Americans. When the Americans decided to get involved, they said, oh, why don't we absorb your team? Well, it turns out that our guy was an ardent communist and had already been giving information to the Russians for quite a while. But how about this for a clusterfuck, right? They flew the Russians' top nuclear agent and dropped him right in the middle of the Manhattan Project, right? Literally, they flew their asset in. And the Russians lost contact with him. Like, where's our guy gone? And he finally makes contact with them and like, where are you? Oh, we're in Los Alamos. Woo! Right, yay! So they do the bomb, everything's successful, everyone has a pat on the back, blah, 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 blah. Brits go back home. The Americans, as soon as we're out the door, the Americans are like, ha, 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 suckers, we're not sharing fuck all with you, go, right? So when he gets back, we're like, hey, can you tell us what you did? And basically, Klaus Fuchs was stealing intel off the Americans to give to the Brits to get our project back up and starting, but at the same time, supplying it to the Russians as well. So there's a story about Klaus Fuchs meeting his handler in London, and he's got the plans to Fat Boy basically stuffed down his trousers, and a little tube of some metal thing, right? Finds this Russian, just this Russian case officer, basically, just some spook in London, right? Not connect, no specialist knowledge, just at the listening station, boom. Meets Klaus Fuchs, gives him the plans, gives him this metal stuff, says, keep good care of that, they're gonna need it. Dude straps the metal stuff to the side of his chest, sticks the plans in his suitcase, flies out to Moscow, hands over the plans, gives over the metal stuff, and then for the rest of his life has radiation burns on the side of his belly. He'd flown uranium-235 strapped to the side of his belly on a commercial flight. Had no idea whatsoever, right? So if you look at the data loss, you know, Klaus didn't give a lot of data, right? You know, some reports and some files, but the implications are massive. You know, if you look at the data that Snowden leaked, yeah, there's a lot of it, right? These are just some guesstimates. That's the best we can get, because even General Alexander hasn't got a fucking clue what this guy took, right? These haven't been updated for a while, but yeah, you can imagine there's a lot of data been flowing about recently. So where does it all come from? So when the Russians set off their first nuclear weapon, so the Americans thought they were going to have 10 years monopoly, right? That's what they thought. We have this game-changing weapon. We've got 10 years to cement our monopoly. Within 4 years, Russia sets off their first nuclear weapon, right? And it kind of scares the shit out of the Americans. This begins the McCarthyism trials and stuff like this. But when that incident happens, what starts is the Cold War, right? This is what becomes, which shapes our lives today quite predominantly, right? I mean, we like to believe that we're not in a Cold War, but it doesn't feel much different than it did 20 years ago, right? I mean, there's still a lot of bullshit going on. McCarthyism. If we knew history better, we'd have called this Hooverism, right? That's, you know, if McCarthyism ripped America apart, right? So anyone who was suspected of being un-American, aka communist, was basically blackballed, which is a bit of a problem from Oppenheimer, because basically Oppenheimer, on inspection, would look like a communist, right? His wife was a communist, his brother was a communist, his friends were a communist. The FBI had been tailing him from 1933 when they reviewed his case. See, when any police officer reviews your case, you can hope for this moment, right? Where they're wheeling a big trolley stacked to files. And the person looks at it and goes, it's going to take a while. And they say, it's the other 4 you want to worry about, right? That's how big his file was. I spoke to a friend recently who was telling me, oh, you know, the good old days pre-war, right? At least I had some honor. These motherfuckers were tapping Oppenheimer's lawyer's office. Oppenheimer had a case review for a security clearance, and the quote-unquote prosecution were given tapes by the FBI of their whole legal defense prior to them going in. You know, let's just not fuck about with the Constitution anymore, right? I mean, we don't need that, right? It's communism. So McCarthyism happens. My interest from this comes from an article that I wrote about how hackers, we experience a version of McCarthyism, that if you want to silence someone, you accuse them of being a hacker, right? I mean, you can put them in a jail cell for 5 years without telephone calls. You know, just ask Mitnick. You know, even Al Capone got a bail hearing, right? Mitnick didn't. You know, you can look at, you know, I'm no big fan of Weave, right? But, you know, look at what was done there. The whole list goes on of these instances. And the late, great Aaron Swartz, the great Aaron Swartz, lost his life for checking out too many library books, right? So, you know, McCarthyism is still here. It's still a remnant. We still have a figure of it. It's still there. So if you're wondering where I came from, I spent some time looking at McCarthyism and following where that went, and that's where I got to it from. This is Oppenheimer, who even in today would never get fucking security clearance, right? This guy, put it into a modern context, this guy, you were giving security clearance to the guy that used to hang out with bin Laden. That's basically what you would be doing, right? I mean, this guy had so many red flags. It was unbelievable. I mean, and the reason he got his security clearance was literally a train ride with General Groves. And General Groves asked him, "Are you a communist?" "No." "Okay." Done. And that was it, right? This spit and sawdust cowboy wasn't having any of this lefty communist. So look, are you a communist? "No." "Okay." He wasn't, to be fair. This is Edward Teller. So the atomic weapon is a nasty piece of equipment, right? It's tactical, though. It's a weapon that you can use tactically. What they worked out is that they could use an atomic reaction to set off a thermonuclear reaction, which is, it's pretty shit, right? It's like 1,000 times more powerful than the most powerful atomic weapon that you can think of. There's absolutely no tactical benefit in using a thermonuclear weapon. You basically built a bomb that can nuke Moscow. That's it, right? There is nothing else. When they demonstrated it at Bikini Bay, they evaporated the island that they tested it on, right? Let's just get that into context. They blew an island away, gone, no more, no landmass, gone. That's how powerful this thing is, right? Lot smaller, far, far more deadly. Oppenheimer was very much against the thermonuclear weapon. Basically what he said was, and it's surprise, surprise, right? What he said was, the only reason the Russians have a nuclear weapon is because we have a nuclear weapon. And if we build a thermonuclear weapon, guess what? The Russians will have a thermonuclear weapon, right? They built one because of us. If we do this, they'll build one because of us. And these weapons have no tactical advantage. They will just end the world. And it was his opposition against the thermonuclear weapon which inspired his hearing that got him to lose his security clearance. The guy that gave America its nuclear project was deemed unsafe to know about the nuclear project. I'll let you work that shit out, right? Well, it's, you know, it's kind of strange because we have this in security all the time. The shit that they said they weren't going to do, they did. Because guess what? When the Russians got their thermonuke, when America made its thermonuke, Russia made its thermonuke not so long afterwards. Well, here we go with the security shit, right? So, all the shit they said they weren't doing, they're totally doing. And why were they doing it? Cyberwar, right? Cyber. If you're wondering, these are people in uniforms. I have a question that I've asked everyone. Why is it that drone operators wear flight suits, right? There's something in that logic that just doesn't work for me. You're not supposed to be in that. The flight is in flight. Right, never mind. Okay, but Cyberwar. And we've said this for a long time, right? Like, here is something that happened in 1952 replaying out in 2014. The BND, which is the German equivalent of the NSA, went back to the Bundestag, which is the German equivalent of the government, and said, we need 300 million euros to compete against the NSA in the exploit purchasing business. They literally, like, we need more money to buy more cyber weapons because the Americans have got it. And they started a cottage industry. Firstly, I think they need another zero. But this is the beginning, right? We're now, you know, you don't have to worry about bad guys buying 0 days, right? They're going to be outpriced in the market by the industrial military complex when it boils down to it. So, yeah, this is already starting to happen, right? This is just a country that went on record with it. I mean, God knows who else is starting up the game. At some point, you have to have a Snowden comment. I'm kind of grateful for Snowden because it means I have to stop doing Sanzu comments and I can move to Snowden comments now. So all is good, right? But basically, he said, you know, we have our computer scientists have their atomic bomb moment, and we do, right? We bit by piece do things as researchers that seem without weight, don't seem so important. And when they're connected into bigger things, start to become more important. Let's get this clear. Metadata kills, right? That's as simple as that, right? When they launched their attacks on bin Laden, it was purely metadata that they went on. They were right this time. There's a lot of people in weddings in Pakistan where they were wrong. You know, so when we say that metadata, oh, you know, we're not collecting content data, we're collecting metadata. Yeah, people die on that shit, right? And this is not just it. I mean, we teach as a community, we teach security, but we have very little concept of the implications of where we go. Such like Gilmalto, you know, that's the security industry that broke SIM cards. Yay for us. You know, we screwed the telecommunications industry over. Win. You know, if we look at the companies that were targeted, these were American companies targeted by an American agency. What luck do you think that we're going to have when Google, when PayPal are targeted by their own nation? It gives you some worries, right? This is really shitty for you to see, so sucks to be you, right? So this is the budget from 2013 for US national intelligence, which sits at $52.6 billion in 2013, right? This is what they're spending on spooks and cyber, blah, blah, blah. You know people where this money will have trickled down to, by the way. I'm going to do a HP quote, just to show you that I do have some corporate blue blood somewhere, right? HP reckoned in 2013 the global spending on defense products, globally, that's the planet, was $40 billion, right? One country spent more on offensive operations, massively, than we spend globally on defense. So that's to tell you something, right? That we're in a very, very precarious situation. And it's a lot like the military-industrial complex. I feel kind of glad that I've managed to get all these like lefty liberal rants out of the way, right? But the problem is that the situation that we're in, can you imagine the NSA saying, hey, there's no more threats, it's all good, we can go home. We don't need any of that $53.6 billion anymore, right? It's a bit like polar bears voting for lax controls on carbon emissions, right? I mean, the military-industrial complex, you know, Raytheon, and Boeing and all of these other companies that make money from war. You're going to have to turn around and get these people to say, no, it's not going to happen. It doesn't happen, right? It's never going to be the case. You know, but what we find is that governments will turn to these companies to give expert opinion on the situation. So you're going to speak to Raytheon about how safe the world is. And what do you expect Raytheon to say? Probably going to need some more bombs, right? How many of you know where this quote is from? War is peace. This is, yeah, it's a little bit screwed up with the reference. War is peace is a 1984 reference. If you haven't read 1984, don't mistake it for an operational manual. If you have read it, read it again today with today's context, right? Read it today again with what's happening, and it's a very scary read. I read it just before I did this talk a few months ago. I read it before, but it was a little bit more hard-hitting when I'm like, shit, it would be a lot worse if we did it, right? Some of the stuff in 1984 is a little bit less horrible than us, right? So war is peace. I mean, we have a system that is continually designing to, I mean, it's the European way, right? European way is war, war, war. That's all we've done. This is General Alexander. This is General Alexander lying to his bosses. And this is General Alexander lying to us at Black Hat. Right? So, yeah, you can get away with not telling the truth as long as you have stripes and stars, right? This is Grove, if you're wondering. He's the military guy. He built the Pentagon. He's pretty cool. Can be a bit of an ass, but no General Alexander, right? So I'm going to do some conclusions. A lot of this is about, the problem is we seem to have, speaking to engineers, security minds about it. And, freedom is something as simple as knowing that 2 + 2 = 4. That's what freedom actually ultimately is, right? And a lot of what we're going on now is trying to have like asymmetric information where people take control of data and we're not able to share it. I've said this a number of times about the whole NSA leaks. It's people bang on as though Snowden, if Snowden spied on people's emails, it's not. If the truth screws your operations up, maybe your operations are a little bit fucked to start off with, right? But freedom is to know that 2 + 2 = 4, and it's a freedom that we're losing massively. Censorship, so on and so forth. And I wonder if a lot of the way, how many of you read Brave New World? All I can say is net neutrality, right? I mean, if you want to look at what damage you can do if you turn the PSN off on the PlayStation Network off on Christmas Day, right? You could probably start riots. What happens if we turn all the Netflix off in the world? And laugh and joke, but the very means that we use for communication is greatly being affected with, and it's like Soma, right? We are a lot like physicists. If we're not careful, the thing is that people are not going to ask us how to use our research very much longer. To build nuclear weapons doesn't require nuclear physicists anymore, right? It requires a factory. And we will get to this point in security, offensive security, where it does not require security consultants talking about ethics and morals to launch an attack against any one of us. I'm going to leave you with, hopefully, with this quote. Those who can make you believe in absurdities can make you commit atrocities. I feel that this is pretty relevant to where we are, all in all. So, that being said, I am a little bit over time, but you all came in a little bit late. If you want to get a hold of me, as Linus Torvalds says, feel free to email me and I'll feel free to ignore it, right? But I would like to thank you for coming, and I would like to thank you guys, the volunteers, and you guys for listening. Thank you.